Alas, it is I, the poser,
poser.
Jason Graves, and the highest form of praise I will bestow upon Ys 4 Mask of the Sun is that it left me wanting more. There have been many games called Ys 4. Most people seem to enjoy the PC Engine game more than this one, though you can only trust a TurboGrafx-16 fan about as much as someone who needs a haircut. I can only speak for the one edition, Mask of the Sun on the Super Famicom, and it was genuinely impressive. If Final Fantasy is the blue text boxes, Dragon Quest is the iconic slime, then Ys is this border around the play area and the ever-present player and enemy meters. Unlike those other series, what we have here is the continuing adventures of just one guy. They're like traditional media sequels, like a movie sequel, not like the substantial number of video game sequels that build off themselves mechanically, all the while reinventing the wheel in regards to story and character. Our hero, whose experiences we're continuing, is a fine one. His thirst for adventure so great that a message in a bottle with a note as vague as "please save Celceta" suffices as his call to action. Mask of the Sun is similar in plot to Ys 3, Wanderers from the Ys. There's a militant force trying to bully these small communities into obtaining these powerful MacGuffins. As a concept, on paper, the two games are almost the same, except you're protecting more than one town in this game. Sure, 4 does introduce more moving parts than that, but really none of them did much for me. There's an ancient hero who telepathically talks to you sometimes, there's a legendary sword, a prophecy that one will save the land, or whatever. You know, the usual generic stuff you'd typically see. What impresses me is that even though there are way more NPCs this time around, they're just as well thought out as they were in 3, and their dialogue changes fairly often to coincide with events in the story. The fan translation community consistently does God's work as well as God himself could. I have not read a poorly written translation yet, and this one is no exception. The color-coded text, which I'm not sure if it was an invention of the fan translators, it might have already been in the game, but regardless, it's really cool. The text is color-coded so you can keep track of who's speaking. In the absence of character portraits, these get the job done quite nicely. The game as a whole reminds me of Zelda Link's Awakening, in that we have a smaller game world, a super basic plot, but you don't really end up caring because of the memorable characters and the way our tale is presented. I like the characters we have, but the game is so short, it doesn't feel like any of them get their just desserts. Which leads me to the beautiful thing about Ys, is that since it's trying to tell a continuing story across multiple games, not every character needs to be the focus every time. For example, the character Dogi. If your frame of reference is just Mask of the Sun, you'd probably call him underdeveloped. But because I've played 3, I know that he's our hero's longtime, stalwart friend. I admire how this game sets up things well in advance. Oftentimes you'll hear about a character before they become relevant, such as the information vendor who you hear about in the opening town, or the multiple references to our old friend, Dogi, before he breaks you out of prison. Okay, so I think I'm going crazy. Did Dogi break Adel out of prison in this game? Because I've gone through all of my footage so many times and I'm freaking out, and I can't find it. So either I'm inventing things that happened in this game, or I just lost the footage for that session, and I didn't realize that I lost any footage at all. That, or I just need to comb through it again, but I've combed through it so many times and it's just not there. It doesn't happen. So I guess my question to you is, does Dogi break Adel out of prison in Ys 4 Mask of the Sun? Ys? Ys. The winged statues scattered about are what the final boss ends up looking like. Early on, the first action segment, I'll call it, has this mysterious square hole on a pedestal. You can't interact with it, but it's a memorable spot. Its importance is further reinforced later when you gain the ability to fast travel by it being an option. So when you obtain a square MacGuffin, hopefully you'll realize that you need to return here to unlock the final area. This is a briskly paced game. It does not waste a considerable amount of time. It's constantly giving you places to see and things to do. An average 2-hour play session might take you from a quaint village, to dank caves, to forest treetop towns, to ancient Aztec temples. It's decidedly compact. Mask of the Sun is loaded with smaller details contributing to its appeal. We need to venture no further than the first playable screen to observe this. When getting onto a boat, this animation of these bros moving the plank onto the ship, I love it. A lesser game would fade to black, or maybe have the plank robotically retract into the ship. I also like how the game both begins and ends on this exact scream. Something I've heard criticism on, but was infinitely charming to me. There are a couple of dialogue choices where if you choose the wrong one, it results in an instant game over. It's shocking, and hilarious to me, really. You die so much in these games that one single death hopefully doesn't mean much. By the time any of these happen, you should have already learned that you should save often anyway. The game even plays with your expectations with these dialogue choices later on, when the wrong choice here doesn't result in a death, but it results in you being turned into a demon. Now, as a demon, you can't fight enemies or progress with the game, so it's essentially a soft lock. But the game doesn't actually give you a formal game over. It relies on you to reload your save. Ys 4 has 5 save slots for a reason, and if you don't use every save file in a rotating fashion when given the option, well, then I am formally uninviting you from my house for life. You go back to the world from the first 2 games, and I'm missing out. It's a real shame. I'm surrounded by references, and I can't fully understand a single one of them because I've never played Ys 1 or 2. This is like the Dragon Warrior Elfguard moment, yet it's completely whizzing over my head. For my final point, I have 2 words for you. Bump combat. The act of running into enemies, no attack animation, no button presses needed. You nudge them. Think of it like playing basketball. If you have the ball and you ram into your opponent head on, well, that's no good. That's an offensive charge on you. You'll take damage. Yet if you hit them at any kind of an angle, well, now that's a block and you're going to the free throw line. It was pioneered by things like Hide Glide and the first 2 games in the Ys series. Yet it seems like, even though many other aspects of these games live on in modern day gaming, bump combat has become a relic nobody seems too keen on revisiting. Why is that? Is it to avoid the appearances of laziness? Even the Ys series would eventually ditch it, throw it aside like some kind of ancient irrelevancy. It's not like the system doesn't hold any merit. For example, it makes backtracking easier. It makes the game possible to play with one hand, speeds up the grinding process. And you can't tell me something like Lagoon, or dare I say Soul Blazer, wouldn't have been improved if they had simply used bump combat. Well, anyway, never trust anyone who needs a haircut, and bring back bump combat.